The first time Dan Whitaker saw the woman, she was standing at the edge of his gravel drive in wedge sandals, designer sunglasses, and a clipboard under one arm, like she'd been hired to audit the land. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She pointed. "That structure doesn't comply with Red Oak Valley HOA standards," she said, voice thin and sharp, like metal scraping glass. Dan paused in the middle of unstrapping a load of lumber from his truck. He blinked once. "It's a barn," he said simply. "There are appearance regulations. Siding. Roofing. Color palette. You're required to submit designs for approval." She didn't blink back. "The community expects standards." Dan looked over at the hill behind her, rolling and golden, dotted with cypress and oak, 20 acres of unincorporated land that sloped down from his ranch and sat squarely outside the boundaries of the HOA. His land. Not theirs. Not hers. He didn't say anything. Just turned back to his truck and kept working. That was how it started. With a pointed finger and a line drawn in someone else's sand, Dan had been retired from state forestry management for 6 years. He'd spent most of his adult life fighting wildfires, building fire breaks, clearing underbrush, and leading crews into places most people couldn't pronounce. When he left, he didn't want ceremony. He wanted space. He bought the land near Red Oak Valley with cash, his savings, his pension, and a little extra from an old friend who owed him a favor. It wasn't just a property. It was a reclamation. And own neighbors on 3 sides. The HOA on the 4th. Close enough for complaints, but not close enough to touch his boundaries. Or so he thought. The woman, he would later learn, was Karen Mason, president of the Red Oak Valley Homeowners Association. A woman who had never farmed, never owned a dog over 20 pounds, never lived outside a gate with a keypad. She liked order, trimmed hedges, cars and garages. No barns. No livestock. And certainly no one like Dan. He ignored her first visit. And the second. But by the third, when she brought 2 other board members with her and began photographing his barn from the property line, he told them to leave. "You have no jurisdiction here," he said. "Not a damn inch." Karen smiled with humor. "It's not just jurisdiction. It's precedent. Your barn affects property values. Your choices affect our community." Dan's answer was silence, and the installation of a steel gate with a motion sensor camera and a new sign welded onto the front post. Private property. No trespassing. No drone zone. That should have been enough. But it never is, with people like Karen. When power is their diet, lines don't stop them. They step over, fly above, or dig underneath. The first drone came a week later. Dan heard it before he saw it, high-pitched, persistent, like a mosquito with a camera. It hovered above the barn for a full 5 minutes, sweeping slowly left to right, pausing as if inspecting his roofline. It made a second pass over the corral, then zipped back toward the subdivision like it was on a leash. He checked the camera logs. Nothing clear. No pilot in sight. The second drone flew lower. Slower. This time over the main house. Dan stepped out on the porch, shotgun in one hand, just watching. It didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. It hovered 10 feet above him, filming. He didn't shoot. He didn't move. But he memorized its frame, its model, its features. The third drone didn't fly back. That was because Jang got to it. Jang was a 170-pound South African borbal, half mastiff, half tank, and all loyalty. Dan had raised him from a pup after rescuing him from a fire-damaged kennel in Fresno. The dog had been through smoke storms and snakes. A drone didn't scare him. It angered him. Dan had been in the barn when it happened. He heard the buzz first, then the snarl, then the unmistakable sound of rotors cracking against teeth and gravel. By the time he reached the yard, Jang was sitting like a statue beside a crumpled pile of carbon fiber and circuits, tail thumping like he'd just caught a rabbit. The drone's camera was still blinking. Dan picked up the carcass, carried it into the shop, and placed it on the bench like an autopsy. It didn't take long to trace it. The serial number had been filed off, but the flight log hadn't been wiped. GPS data. Signal handshakes. Battery sync records. IT had been launched from just across the ridge. HOA land. Dan called his attorney. Robert Caldwell was a longtime friend and former prosecutor who specialized in property and civil rights law. When Dan told him what had happened, he didn't sound surprised. "You've got 2 problems," Robert said. "One's a boundary issue. The other's ego. And ego is the harder one to fence." Dan gave him the drone, the camera logs, the gate cam footage, Jang's vet record in case there was a liability claim. Robert filed a cease and desist and notified local law enforcement. That's when the smear campaign began. Anonymous tips. Complaints filed with the county. Allegations about unpermitted structures, noise violations, animal cruelty. A local blogger ran a piece accusing Dan of terrorizing Red Oak Valley with aggressive dogs and unsightly construction. Photos of the barn appeared online, edited to look darker, more sinister. Dan didn't budge. He documented everything. Saved every article. Every email. Every false claim. But the pressure wore. Not on him. On the land. Real estate agents stopped showing homes on his side of the development. Rumors spread that his property was going to be seized. That the HOA was planning to annex his land into the subdivision. That's when Robert changed strategy. "We're not playing defense anymore," he said. "We're going on the offensive." He subpoenaed Karen Mason's drone registration, her HOA emails, her phone records. He used the drone's GPS data to pinpoint flight origins. He requested the HOA's financial disclosures for the past 5 years. What they found turned a property dispute into a legal inferno. Karen had used HOA funds to purchase and maintain multiple surveillance drones under the guise of security testing. She had authorized flyovers without consent. Worse, several of the board members had known and had approved discretionary budgets to keep the program quiet. But that was just the surface. One board member, facing legal pressure, flipped. Testified that Karen had been using drone footage to selectively target homeowners she disliked. To pressure sales. To control landscaping compliance. To harass. She had sold footage to private parties. She had hidden money through fake contracts with shell landscaping firms. She had weaponized governance. The trial was open to the public. The courtroom was packed. Karen's attorneys argued she had been protecting the community. That drones were modern tools. That Dan had overreacted. But when the footage played, dozens of hours of homes, backyards, private spaces, families and moments they didn't know were being captured, the room went silent. Dan testified last. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The judge ruled in his favor. Karen Mason was found guilty of unlawful surveillance, harassment, and conspiracy. She was fined heavily, ordered to pay damages, and removed from her post. Criminal charges were pending. The HOA itself faced civil scrutiny and restructuring. Dan returned home with Jang riding shotgun and no drones in the sky. That week, he installed a new sign beneath the old one at the gate. You watch, you pay. In the weeks that followed the court ruling, Dan expected things to quiet down. What he didn't expect was the silence that came with it. Not just from Karen Mason, who had disappeared into a tangle of legal proceedings and news camera footage, but from the entire Red Oak Valley community. The same neighbors who once drove past his gate and scowled now slowed down, some waving, some not, but none with the same contempt they used to wear like a badge. And no one wanted to admit they'd look the other way while their HOA president turned their neighborhood into a surveillance state. But they did look. Some of them even benefited. Others had been too afraid to speak. After the trial, that fear cracked. A few came by to apologize. Dan didn't hold it against them. He wasn't built to carry grudges. He carried fire lines, 50-pound hose packs, and dead weight when needed, but never bitterness. It wasn't useful. What stuck with him, though, was the woman from 3 houses inside the HOA border, the one with the disabled son. She'd shown up at his gate one afternoon, nervous, eyes darting back toward the road. She wasn't sure if she should be there. Dan brought her lemonade and let her talk. Karen's drones had flown over her backyard for months. She'd assumed it was HOA maintenance. But when she saw her own swing set on the news during the trial, she realized how wrong she'd been. "We let it happen," she said quietly, "because we thought they were helping. Because they said it was safe." Dan didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Safe doesn't look like that." More stories came out. HOA corruption wasn't new, but the drone footage made it real, tangible. People saw themselves in the videos. Vulnerable. Exposed. The conversation shifted from property values and aesthetic guidelines to surveillance ethics, privacy rights, and the legal overreach of unelected neighborhood boards. Robert Caldwell, Dan's lawyer, found himself fielding interviews from every outlet that could find his number. Everyone from local news anchors to constitutional law podcasts wanted a statement. "This isn't just about one rancher and one drone," Robert said on one live segment. "This is about the unchecked power of small institutions. People think it takes a government to violate your rights. Sometimes all it takes is your neighbor and a camera." Dan stayed off the air. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. But whether he liked it or not, the symbol had taken root. His barn, the same one Karen tried to shut down, became a quiet destination. Not a tourist site. Not something marked on a map. But a kind of local pilgrimage for those fed up with being told how to live. It started with a trucker from Texas who left a note tucked under Dan's gate post. "Thanks for reminding us that fences can be honest things." Then came a couple from Arizona who parked on the road and just stared at the barn for 10 minutes before driving off. Someone started leaving miniature signs in his mailbox. "No-fly zone, watchdogs not welcome, property means private." Dan kept them in a drawer in the shop, next to his old fire helmet. Melinda Bowers, a professor from a state university in Sacramento, reached out next. She'd been teaching courses on technology and civil liberties for years. After reading about the trial, she invited Dan to speak to her students. He declined at first. But after some time, after watching enough people pass by his land and recognize something in it that maybe he hadn't known was there himself, he changed his mind. "I'm not a speaker," he warned her when he called. "You're not supposed to be," she replied. "You're just supposed to tell the truth." So he did. Dan walked into the lecture hall in a clean shirt, jeans, boots still dusty, and told a group of 20-year-olds about property lines, drone rotors, the weight of being watched, and how quickly people can turn on you when you refuse to fall in line. He told them about the sound of surveillance. That thin hum just above your head. The kind of noise that ruins silence without announcing itself. He told them about Jang, and how sometimes a dog sees clearer than a man. And then he told them what they all came to hear, how he stood up, how he pushed back, and how it didn't take anything more than evidence, patience, and the refusal to be afraid. The students clapped, but Dan didn't stay for questions. He wasn't there to be admired, but on the way out, a student ran after him, tall, nervous, still holding her notebook. "Can I ask just one thing?" she said, breathless. Dan waited. "What if the law is not on your side? What if they've already decided who's right?" Dan looked at her for a long time, then said something he hadn't planned. "Then you build your own barn anyway. Let them come. And you don't run." Word spread from that day, quietly at first, then louder. Other property owners, many who had never spoken up, began filing challenges against their HOAs. A retired Marine in Montana sued his board over gate surveillance. A single mother in Nevada took a restraining order out on her HOA president for using a drone to film her backyard at night. A woman in Colorado organized a neighborhood meeting where she read excerpts from Dan's court testimony aloud. Karen Mason's name became shorthand for authoritarian HOA abuse. Pulling a Karen didn't mean asking to see the manager anymore. It meant flying a drone where it didn't belong and getting dragged into court for it. But while the country debated and litigated, Dan just lived. He finished the barn, painted it earth red, built a loft inside, reinforced the frame, and hung Jang's harness from one of the wall beams like a badge. He started keeping bees. Small hives in the backfield. Quiet workers. No one to please. No cameras. Jang got older slower, but still barked when the wind changed or an engine sounded off. Dan installed new fences anyway. Not to keep people out. Just to remind them where they stood. One afternoon, Robert came by with papers. "I think you should consider filing a suit against the HOA as an entity," he said. "With the damages you've already won, you could set a federal precedent. HOA surveillance policy is practically lawless in some states." Dan nodded. I'll think on it. But he already knew the answer. He wasn't interested in a national fight. Not in lawsuits, stages, or cameras. He'd won what mattered. He had his land. His line. His dog. His barn. And most of all, he had silence again, the real kind. The kind you protect with signs, fences, and a refusal to back up when someone tells you their rules matter more than your freedom. By the time the frost settled over the hills in late November, the name Dan Whitaker had already entered more than a few legal journals, newspaper editorials, and internet forums. But the man himself remained unchanged, at least in the ways that mattered. He still rose before the sun. He still fed the bees in the back pasture, still oiled the hinges of his barn doors, and still kept a set of work gloves on the dashboard of his truck. From a distance, it would have been easy to mistake his life for something untouched by conflict. The house stood upright. The fields were trimmed. The fences were clean and properly marked. But peace, as Dan knew by now, didn't mean quiet. It meant readiness. It meant clarity. And ever since the legal victory over the Red Oak Valley HOA and the exposure of Karen Mason's surveillance crimes, Dan had felt the world turning a bit too quietly in his direction. There were too many emails from journalists. Too many letters from law students. Too many calls from realtors, city planners, and even state senators asking for interviews, quotes, or appearances. Dan ignored most of them. He wasn't looking to become a movement. He just wanted to be left alone. But it didn't stop others from seeing him as a symbol of property rights, of resistance, of freedom. The first wave came in the form of other property owners reaching out, not just from California, but from Texas, Idaho, Montana, and even suburban neighborhoods in Virginia and Florida. Many shared stories that echoed his own: drone flyovers, aggressive HOA fines, retaliation for refusing to comply. One man from Nevada had cameras installed in his fruit orchard by an HOA claiming it was wildlife research. A woman in Utah said she'd been fined for putting up a curtain on her second-story window because it didn't match the HOA's approved aesthetic. An older couple in upstate New York claimed they were sued for refusing to let an HOA-approved drone fly over their pond to photograph irrigation layout. The stories were wild, but disturbingly real. Dan listened when he had the energy. He started keeping a file folder labeled letters, calls, cases. It sat beside his toolbox, thicker every month. Sometimes he thought about tossing it all into the fire pit, but every time he read one that mirrored the humiliation he'd felt, that moment of being told by a stranger what he could and couldn't do on land he paid for, bled for, lived for, he knew he couldn't stay silent. So he began writing, not speeches, not declarations, but letters, quiet ones. Handwritten replies on heavy cards. To a veteran in Colorado who'd been drone stalked by his HOA while raising chickens. Your dignity doesn't need a permit. To a retired nurse in Oregon who was fined for installing an outdoor shower. Privacy is not an eyesore. And to a young woman in North Carolina whose back porch was photographed without her knowledge for a community aesthetics audit. Tell them you do not exist for their view. Dan didn't think of himself as a writer. He didn't edit or workshop or strategize. He wrote the way he built his fence lines, deliberately, one section at a time, straight and grounded. But those letters started circulating online. Recipients scanned them, shared them on forums, reposted them to digital civil rights groups. A compilation thread on Reddit titled Dan Whitaker Wisdom reached over 1 million views. One law school professor printed 3 of Dan's letters on the wall of her classroom beneath the heading, Civic Resistance in Plain Language. Dan didn't know what Reddit was. He just kept living. Then came the mail from state offices, mostly legislative aides and clerks, asking if he'd be willing to give a statement in support of drone privacy legislation in California and potentially at the federal level. He ignored the first 2 batches. The third came with a handwritten note from an assemblywoman he remembered seeing on the news after a wildfire in Redding. She'd helped evacuate residents herself. The note said simply, Mr. Whitaker, we don't want to use you, but we need your voice. Even if just for the record. He sighed, folded the letter twice, set it on the counter. Melinda Bowers, the university professor who had once invited him to speak in her classroom, visited the ranch a few days later. She'd heard about the legislative request and offered to help him prepare a written statement. Dan agreed, but on one condition. No speeches, just facts. Together, they wrote a letter of testimony. 1 page. No legalese. No fiery rhetoric. Just a man describing what it feels like to be watched on your own land, and what it means when the law doesn't protect your sky. It was read aloud on the assembly floor in Sacramento by the same representative who'd written to him. The bill passed by a wide margin. That night, Melinda sent him a simple message: you just helped protect over 10 million people. Dan didn't smile, but he felt something warm beneath his ribs. Something like steadiness. Something like purpose. He fought for himself. Now the fight had grown. Spring returned early that year. The almond trees bloomed ahead of schedule. The hills turned green, with thin blades of new grass. And the quiet that Dan had worked so hard to preserve began, once again, to bend beneath the pressure of unwanted attention. It started with a low thrum, not the amateur buzz of a hobbyist drone, or the shaky flight path of a teenager's toy. This one was smooth, precise, calibrated. It came in low from the east, just outside Red Oak Valley, over the long ridge that bordered the far corner of Dan's property, just close enough to skirt legality. It hovered, pivoted, then flew away. Dan didn't chase it. Not at first, but 3 days later, it came again. Then again the next week, this time with a second drone, smaller, faster, clearly operating in tandem. Dan recorded the flight patterns, measured the approach angles, tracked the time of day. They were mapping. He filed a report with the sheriff's office, but it was met with a shrug. No evidence of intrusion, the deputy said. They're staying outside your airspace. Technically, that word had become poison. Dan returned to his workshop, reviewed the last footage from his property sensors. He layered the heat signatures with air pressure data, wind drift, and noise profile. Then he pulled his old military-grade binoculars off the shelf and spent 4 hours scanning the ridge. He found them on the 5th day. 2 men in a silver truck parked half a mile off the main access road. Laptops open. One wore a jacket with a patch that read, AeroCorp Flight Systems. Dan made a call to Robert Caldwell. They're testing prototype drones? Robert said after a few hours of digging. Defense contractors. Private development. Probably got a testing license from the county. Dan didn't need to ask. He already knew. His land, his privacy, was being used as a metric for low-risk observational zones. In short, his property had become a testing ground for a company pushing the limits of drone tech. And no one had asked. Not the county. Not the company. Not the developers who likely had no idea who he was or what he had already fought. That night, Dan stood beneath the stars and watched the sky flicker with mechanical movement. The drones were smaller now. Faster. Quieter. Some didn't even use visible rotors anymore. Silent gliders with microthermal lenses. It wasn't just a breach of peace. It was a preview of the future. And it was happening again. This time, Dan didn't wait for them to cross the line. He filed a cease and desist directly against AeroCorp. Robert drafted the language. Sharp. Undeniable. It accused the company of passive airspace trespass, psychological harassment, and unauthorized targeting of civilian residential zones for data acquisition. The company's lawyers responded with the same corporate confidence Dan had seen in Karen Mason's eyes years ago. Our flight paths do not constitute trespass. All tests are in compliance with FAA guidelines. No residential structures were directly surveilled. Dan read the letter twice. Then he went public. He released his surveillance data. He compiled a detailed report showing how AeroCorp had used his property in training models without explicit consent. He leaked it to a journalist who'd covered his original trial. The story exploded. Veteran rancher who took down HOA now faces drone testing giant private property once again in crosshairs of sky surveillance. Who owns the air above your land? The public backlash was swift. The headline caught attention, but the footage did the real damage. Thermal camera overlays showing drones circling livestock, dipping within 30 feet of Dan's workshop roof, recording the routines of a man who had already fought once to keep eyes out of his sky. This time, though, Dan wasn't alone. Civil rights groups, property owners associations, digital privacy watchdogs, even libertarian influencers. They rallied behind him. Hundreds of property owners began requesting transparency from local counties about who was flying drones above their homes. The FAA issued a public statement affirming their commitment to residential airspace dialogue. But no policy shifted. Dan filed suit. This wasn't a local skirmish anymore. It was a federal lawsuit, backed by legal volunteers and crowd-funded donations from people who had never met Dan, but who now saw him as the man willing to take the fight where others wouldn't. The court battle took 16 months. During that time, Dan rarely left the property. His health began to wear. He lost weight, slept less, spent more time pacing the pasture with a rifle across his shoulder, not out of paranoia, but principle. The land needed a watcher. A real one. Melinda Bowers visited frequently, sometimes to help with paperwork, sometimes just to sit on the porch with coffee. She watched the toll it took on him. Watched the way his hands shook when he read a new motion filing. Watched the way he'd stare into the hills, like they might betray him. This isn't just your fight anymore, she said once. I never wanted it to be a fight at all, Dan replied. You didn't choose the fight. You chose to draw the line. That's not the same thing. When the ruling came, it wasn't everything he'd hoped, but it was enough. The court recognized that drone testing near residential property without notice constituted targeted atmospheric intrusion. AeroCorp was ordered to suspend all operations within 3 miles of registered private land without landowner consent. It wasn't federal reform, but it was precedent. Dan's property was, once again, his. After the second courtroom victory, Dan declined all interviews. The major networks came knocking again. One offered a documentary. Another wanted to fly him out for a panel on drone ethics and American freedom. He didn't even call them back. The truth was, he was tired. Not just the kind of tired that comes from litigation or fieldwork or old injuries, but the kind that seeps into the bones when you've spent too long being a wall, the last thing between your home and a world that no longer understands what private means. The ranch had held through 2 legal sieges and 5 years of unrelenting surveillance. First by a power-hungry HOA, then by a multi-million-dollar defense contractor. Yet every time Dan looked out across his pasture, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. He walked the fence lines every morning. Still fed the bees. Still sharpened tools by hand. But the motion-activated cameras around the property had become more sensitive, the notification chimes more frequent. The drones didn't come anymore, not visibly. But Dan had developed an ear for the unnatural. Sometimes he'd hear something high in the air, just faint enough to make him doubt. Melinda visited more often after the court cases wrapped. She brought students now, 1 or 2 at a time, by appointment only. They came not as reporters, not as activists, but as listeners. Some were law students. Others studied ethics, or urban planning, or digital rights. They didn't ask questions right away. They helped him clear brush. Repaired sections of fencing. Asked about Jang, whose gravestone still sat under the oak tree with dried wildflowers around it. Then, when the sun dipped lower and their hands were sore, they'd sit by the barn and ask what it had all meant. Dan never gave speeches. He told stories. Short ones. About silence. About trespass. About drawing a line and never moving it, no matter how polite the voice was on the other side. Some of the students cried. Some just nodded. And a few asked if they could start their own signs. Dan showed them how to carve. No drone zone on one side. Consent lives here on the back. He never charged for them. He just asked one thing. Mean it. In the summer of that year, a new law passed in Congress. Titled the Whitaker-Rosenfield Act, it mandated that all non-government drone operations in residential airspace require consent from the landowner, no exceptions. It established a federal drone privacy registry, funded drone jamming research for civilian use, and created a new classification of criminal trespass for aerial surveillance. Dan's name was in the title, but no one had asked him first. He only found out because Melinda called him one morning, nearly laughing through tears. They put your name in the law, she said. He sighed. Reckon they could have used a better one. They used the right one. Reporters asked for comment. Dan wrote a statement by hand. I never asked to be watched, and I never asked to be followed. If this law means that fewer people wake up to the sound of a machine above their house, then it's worth it. But this was never about drones. It was about dignity. Let people be. That's all. The statement ran in full in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and even appeared on a billboard in Missouri paid for by a grassroots land rights group. For all that, Dan never left his ranch. The barn, once just a structure for hay and tools, became a quiet museum of memory. People began sending him gifts, handmade signs, photos of their own. No drone zone. Fences, even thank you cards from children whose schools had adopted new drone-free policies. One wall of the barn was eventually covered in them. He called it the fence line. Dan aged. The fights had taken a toll, even though he'd won them. His left knee stiffened from an old fire injury. His hands curled more. He moved slower. But his eyes were still sharp, and he still knew every inch of his property by feel. Melinda came by every Christmas, bringing food and a new student. On one visit, she asked him something different. Do you ever wish you just ignored the drone? That you kept your head down? Dan didn't answer right away. He walked outside, stood beneath the mounted drone wreckage that still hung above his gate. Rusted, burned by sun, cracked open. A relic now. Then he said, I was never looking to be free. I was just trying to live. But you made a lot of other people free. She said. He looked out across the ridge. The wind moved through the grass. I guess that's how it works sometimes. Dan passed peacefully 3 winters later. No struggle. Just a long breath, a quiet sigh, and stillness. He was buried next to Jane, beneath the oak. The funeral was private. Just Melinda, a few neighbors, and a handful of former students who stood silently, each holding a small piece of reclaimed wood engraved with his words. Privacy is not selfish. It's sacred. His will was simple. The land would remain protected. No commercial use. No sale. No aerial trespass. The barn would stay. The bees would stay. Melinda would be its caretaker. The ranch became a protected homestead. Not a monument. Not a museum. Just a place people could visit if they asked. If they respected the fence. Every now and then, a drone would appear in the sky nearby, but it never crossed the line. Not once. Because the world had changed. Because Dan Whitaker had stood up and said no. Because his silence had been louder than 100 lawsuits. And because somewhere, high above every home and hill in America, that message still hovered. If you want to look, ask first.